Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome back to the Nutrition Blueprint Podcast. Today, we actually have my friend Mitch. He's a local. He's here from Tampa. I'm not sure if you're from here though. Like we'll ask you here in a minute. But Mitch is a coach at South Tampa CrossFit. He's also the founder of Rewild Tribe, and he has a really interesting kind of take on the way that he approaches recovery, movement, and we're gonna simply be chatting with him a little bit more about his his approach to a lot of different things like that, from stress adaptation and injury recovery and all these types of areas. So, but dude, I think it's better if you kind of tell people more about you. We're streaming this on Facebook, so anybody that wants to kind of ask any questions as well, you can. I'm gonna be kind of looking at those as well for Mitch. But Mitch, welcome to the show, man. What's going on?
What's happening, dude? Thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, dude, absolutely. So dude, so first of all, we'll start with your story, right? So where are you from? Are you Tampa native? And at the same time, second thing is kind of how did you get into fitness? Was it recently? Was it kind of you were an athlete growing up? We always like to kind of hear people's stories.
Yeah. So originally from South Jersey, right outside of Philadelphia. And what really got me started in movement stuff, I guess I've always kind of been, really, really fascinated by movement. I used to have a lot of physical anxiety growing up. So if something hurt, or if my breathing felt weird, or if something physically didn't feel right, I would essentially become anxiously obsessed about it, which then led to me learning so much more about movement and exercise and nutrition. And that kind of dysfunctional physical anxiety led to being more productive and more functional, to where I really enjoyed learning about my body and then gaining different tools and skills to then help other people learn about their body. So, I mean, ever since I was little, it'd be, hey, I had this injury. Okay, what does it feel like to palpate it? Why does it hurt more? Why does this make it hurt less? Or I've had a couple surgeries from disconnected tendons and broken bones. So why does this hurt? Why does that feel so much weirder after than before? So all of that stuff together is what continually led me down towards eventually CrossFit. I went to school for health and exercise science in New Jersey as well. And then that expanded more and more as I spent additional years learning from other groups, which my main inspirations essentially are CrossFit. There's another group called StrongFit. I love stuff from this guy, Brian McKenzie. He does a lot of the breathing stuff. Mm-hmm. So all of these different kind of groups together, just to name a few, are where my continuing education has come from. But the base of it all started from that dysfunctional physical anxiety of obsession that then turned into oh, well, now I know more about me and hopefully know enough to help others.
Yeah, man. And I think I've seen a lot of your stuff, right? And there's a million different ways in which I can kind of take this conversation, but I would like to kind of start with the whole concept of movement. So I was originally introduced into this. I think it was a while back where one of my friends from Argentina, he started to do these weird things in the floor, and he called it animal movement. And I know I've seen you do some stuff like that, but the key thing that I've seen you do the most is actually working out and doing a lot of stuff barefoot. And I think you introduced the CrossFit gym that we train at CrossFit Big Wava into some strategies and some things like that to really take care of your feet, and kind of as part of that movement. So can you maybe kind of expand a little bit more about on what that is? Specifically to animal movement, flow, all the different things, which I believe it's something else that you also teach.
Mm-hmm. So in 2017, I learned about this group called the Foot Collective. And I went through their online training program to essentially become a foot nerd, as they call it. And it essentially just opened up my eyes to how important barefoot movement was. And then I started to get into barefoot shoes and foot health. And the way that I like to think about it is, for anyone that's listening to this, think about what a baby's foot looks like when it's first born, right? Very wide splay, the toes are spaced apart, and the foot now of you as an adult looks probably totally different than it did as a child. And that's not a natural thing. That's an unnatural thing, because most people wear unnatural footwear. So they wear shoes that are a little bit too narrow, very stiff bottom of the shoe. There's usually some type of arch support. And then, especially if we're talking about open-toed shoes, there's not always a solid heel attachment, which would be like a traditional flip-flop. And when you do this, when you put this foot in this unnatural environment, it will then change its shape to then fit the shape of the shoe. So whether that's like most people, when they have bunions, right, their big toe points in, when in reality, as an adult, your foot should still be splayed and look like a child's foot.
Open.
Yeah, because, it's this amazing, structure that we have, our foot, and it functions so much better if it's just out of the shoe. And the benefit of barefoot shoes would just be you want to run, or you're training somewhere where the surface is a little bit maybe like, hey, I want to make sure I don't cut my foot. Well, then the benefit of the shoe is it just provides added protection, but it doesn't stop the natural function of your foot. So getting into that then let me learn, training years barefoot leading up to what I do now, is I understand how important it is to have the foot being free or free of limitation by a shoe that someone is wearing. Because the way that I think about it is, imagine wearing a thin blindfold that you can kind of see through. Well, you might bump into some stuff, but you're probably kind of okay. But over time, if you continually increase the thickness of that blindfold, you'll eventually be running into things, knocking stuff over, and it'll be really hard to tell how you're moving and where you're moving. Same exact thing with your foot. So the more thick the shoe is, the more it restricts your movement, the more and more you're blindfolding your feet and preventing it from giving you that proprioceptive feedback to help with your balance, to help with what muscles you feel up the chain, where it can kind of be like your foot helps dictate the muscles that fire up the chain, and then the hip and the way your hip moves helps dictate the structure and balance of the foot. So there's that connection there. And that's why, like, I think so many people have foot issues, why they have knee issues, why they have hip issues, amongst like a whole list of things that come together. But starting with the foot is a really great place to help kind of open people's eyes to changing their movement.
That's fascinating. And now I started thinking more about from the application standpoint. So for people listening to this and they're like, okay, so you're saying that I should do everything barefoot. I should work out barefoot, do everything barefoot. So like, which it may sound like kind of like challenging for some people. I would say probably challenging for me, but I can totally see how this can obviously be helpful. So, when somebody's like kind of like in maybe some of your workshops and things like that, how do you kind of suggest people get started into this, movement barefoot and different things like that to kind of start to incorporate it into their lifestyles for purposes of what you just described?
The best thing that someone can do is following this tool of don't do too much too soon. So kind of like it's a tool, not a rule. So it forces the person to explore on their own. So from the baseline, if your foot starts to get sore, it starts to ache a little bit, put back on your regular shoes or put shoes on. But having these things called toe spacers that splay the toes and go in between the toes is really beneficial, because it's going to help widen the foot. If you have a bunion, it'll actually help over time correct the bunion as much as possible, because bunion is a shoe dysfunction, not really a genetic or not like a genetic adaptation that someone might have. So you wear the toe spacers. If your foot gets sore, you take the toe spacers out. But moving around in it will help strengthen the intrinsic foot muscles, which you can think of that as you have your core in your torso. Well, your core in your foot is your intrinsic foot muscles. So you're strengthening that, and then start with closed chain, non-dynamic movements when you're starting out barefoot, especially if it's loaded. So like a squat is fine, a deadlift is fine, a bench press is fine, but I wouldn't start rocking out power cleans and box jumps and jumping barefoot. You could do some of that very easy and very slow, definitely not in a workout. So then you have that exploration aspect of actually training barefoot, wearing these toe spacers to help correct the foot. And then lastly, investing in a barefoot shoe that you can first start to just wear around in your day-to-day before you actually start training in it. And there's a bunch of different companies out there that have really good barefoot shoes, but just something that's like casual to wear around to get used to walking barefoot.
And then the spacers that you're talking about, because I think I've seen them, those are like the typical ones that you put in between your toes, and you can get that from like Amazon or something like that. And is that something that you also suggest people wearing, like, let's say when they're just walking around the house or when they're sleeping and things like that as well? Because I think I need that.
Yeah. When someone wears the toe spacers, they can definitely get them from Amazon if they just type in toe spacer. There is a company called Correct Toes. They're a really high quality, but they are a little bit more expensive. But just any type of regular, like gel looking toe spacers is fine. And as far as when to wear them, right? Obviously taking them out if your foot starts to feel sore, and you'll be able to increase the time duration. But like you said, wearing them at home when you're walking around is great. unless you have a barefoot shoe, you won't actually be able to wear them in your shoe because the toe box is probably too narrow, right? Like after the ball of the big toe, the shoe on, or the toe box on most shoes usually starts to go in rather than splay out more. So wearing them barefoot will be easiest. And then I definitely actually would not fall asleep with them on, because you can wake up hours later and be like, oh my God, my foot is killing me. For anyone that's had like a retainer for their mouth that they haven't worn in a while, if you all of a sudden just, put it back in and fall asleep with it, you'll wake up with just like your mouth killing you. Same type of thing with your feet.
Okay. That's really, really, really interesting. Okay, cool. So that's definitely something, because I know I've seen you do, and I just didn't really understand exactly the science behind it, what was important and all that kind of stuff. Now, diving into the subject of injury recovery, or just recovery in general, right? So I know you're into CrossFit. I'm into CrossFit. A lot of people that listen to this are into high intensity training, CrossFit. And I think that a lot of times that we focus too much on like the active portion of like, okay, like push yourself as much as you can, lift heavy, do all kind of stuff like that. But we typically suck at like, the stuff that you do with that it's not necessarily going to be like, push yourself as much as you can, which is like recovery, movement, mobility, all the different things like that. And I know you talk a lot about this, and I guess like for you, what are some of those recovery strategies that you have found over the years to be effective, and then really kind of getting a big kind of return on the investment of time for you that you can implement? Because I know obviously we can talk about yoga, we can talk about all the different things like that, but for you, like your top ones that you feel like you like to teach your clients, like your students, all those different things like that, and anywhere you teach.
When it comes to recovery, right, like you've been to the Nordic sauna that they have at Kodawara Yoga Studios. So that's a really great benefit to have throughout the week. And I'm sure we can dive in more to that, but the hot and ice exposure is really good. I really love doing this thing called yoga nidra in the middle of the day. That's another thing from like Brian McKenzie and his group. Even though it's popular, I really enjoy their specific yoga nidra, where it's essentially just a body scan practice that you do. Can be anywhere from like 10 to 30 minutes long, or longer if you prefer. And it puts you into like you're kind of awake, but you're in almost like a daydreaming state where you might come in and out of conscious hearing. And it's like a little bit of like that theta brain wave. You're like awake in bed, but you're not really awake. That's really great to do before sleep to help you transition to sleep better, or to do in the middle of the day. I believe that Brian McKenzie's team, I think, is working with, I'm not positive on this, but I think they're working with Huberman Labs, the Andrew Huberman, to see there's a chance that this type of approach and body scan will actually help people recoup lost REM sleep. So that way that they don't REM rebound when they sleep, which is where you just end up getting a majority of light and REM sleep when you go to bed versus deep sleep. Because if your sleep is poor, then your body tries to make REM sleep up first, even though you can't really make up lost sleep. And then it prevents you from getting that really high quality repair deep sleep. So yoga nidra in the middle of the day is fantastic.
And what does it entail though? Like, is it just like a typical type of yoga type of like movement, or just more of like a sitting and just, or I mean, I'm honestly like clueless as to what it is.
So you're either lying down or sitting in a chair, eyes are closed, and it's just essentially a guided body scan meditation. Usually there's some type of mantra that they'll want you to set. The cool thing about the Shift is Brian McKenzie's group. So the cool thing that Shift does with this is they have you go through the neuroscience of it. So when you essentially set your mantra by saying you as a third person, right? Like you are strong, you are confident, you are insert whatever, you're talking to the emotional part of the brain, the limbic part of the brain. And that's what cares about pleasure and safety. And when you say that, then you kind of unconsciously start to look for something that confirms that in day-to-day life. So if I'm starting to say, you are a good parent or you are a good athlete, you'll start to seek those types of confirmations throughout the day. And even though it might be a little bit of like a confirmation bias, or, when someone goes, I'm going to buy this red car, and then they see that red car everywhere, it's still a benefit because it's helping you build more consistent action towards what you actually want to achieve and manifest. But at the same time, then you're getting the benefit of the sleep behind it. So they're going through things like, okay, you're paying attention to your right eye, then your left eye, then both eyes. And the one interesting thing with the intensity of the body awareness, they'll go, okay, notice like your mouth, your top teeth, your bottom teeth, and then the tip of your tongue, the middle tongue, and the root of the tongue behind the tonsils. Like that's how in depth they'll go on some of them. but they'll just do that for the full body from head to toe. And it's really crazy because there will be parts of it that, for example, for me, my personal experience, I won't remember, but then all of a sudden I'll like hear them saying stuff. And so that would be like hey, I went out of conscious hearing, but I wasn't asleep for sure. And so that's the interesting experience that you start to get during it. But that's the yoga nidra piece. And then the other thing, which might not necessarily be a recovery piece to do after training, and this is probably the main thing that I drive across to the people that I work with, is you have to know the intent of why and how you're going about your training. And then you need to know that training is involving exploring uncertain things that you might not know, because then you're going to potentially find something that's really wonderful, and then exploiting what works. And the reason why the intent and the how is so important is because if I go into the gym every day and my goal is lift the heaviest weight I possibly can, get as many rounds as I can, or get as fast of a time as possible, I'm totally disconnected from the way that I'm breathing, the emotions or thought patterns that I'm having while training, or the muscles that I'm actually feeling while doing the movement. And so there's too much testing and external focus rather than training and internal focus. And it's not bad to want to get the fastest time, the heaviest weight, or the most rounds. That's still important because that can help provide objective measures. But when we pay no attention to the subjective and the internal piece, then we really miss a keystone part of improving your strength and conditioning and overall health and wellness.
And what, because that's actually, because I do the former, right? It's like, okay, fastest time, the most amount of rounds, lift the heaviest weight, I'm feeling good today. So how does one go about that? Like, is it like a specific, like, okay, like my intention for today is just really kind of focus on like, conscious movement and into my snatches or into, my pull-ups or different things like that? Or is it more of like a specific kind of like system that you typically try to kind of like create for yourself before you go into your training sessions, into your training weeks or so forth like that? So I can kind of, because this is something I want to explore for myself as well.
So it can end up being quite a rabbit hole, but the baseline that I like to start people out is, do you have awareness of the muscles that you feel? Are you aware of your breathing at all while you train? And once you have that muscle awareness and you have that awareness of your breath, then it's also, what are you experiencing emotionally when you go in and train? The easy examples that I say for this, let's start with the tension, is when you do a deadlift, are you just doing the deadlift? Or do you feel your glutes, your hammies, your obliques, your low abs, your lats, like all these different muscles that you for sure can over time develop the skill to feel all working together? But if you're just like, well, yeah, I'm just doing the deadlift and I feel stuff on the backside of my body, that's a little bit of a disconnect in the awareness. So it's starting off with the question of, what do you feel while you do the movement? Setting that foundation, then going, okay, here's how we learn how to feel the right stuff. And that's the movement piece. The breath piece, I use the Brian McKenzie description of gears. So gear 1 is you're doing like box breathing stuff, and you can change the way that you're nasal breathing. Gear 2 is nasal breathing only. Gear 3 is you breathe in through the nose. You have a natural pause before you exhale through the mouth. Gear 4 is still in through nose, out through mouth, but there's no natural pause, right? You're kind of like pushing the intensity more as you work your way up. And then gear 5 is mouth breathing. And then a majority of the workouts that we do should be able to be done nasal breathing, with the exception of, if it's a mixed modal thing, like we're rowing and doing really heavy cleans, well, I should be able to nasal breathe on the row, but then have to do a little bit of in through nose, out through mouth, exhale bracing on the cleans, for example, if they're a little bit heavier, because that just makes sense for what the stimulus calls for. So paying attention to the breathing and what you do, because most people, when they start to try and nasal breathe for the first time, they'll feel like they're running out of breath or they're drowning really quickly. But the nose is kind of like a you use it or lose it type organ on our face. And then the last piece with the emotional awareness and the experience of the individual would be, are you aware of the movements that you really love to do and the movements that you really hate to do? Most people are, right? Like someone would go, I love thrusters and pull-ups, but like, I do not want to assault bike. I don't want to run. And then a little bit more broad than that is, I love sprinting workouts, or I love heavy lifting, or I love the grind, long endurance workouts. For me, I love the sprint and I hate the long grind. But then the question becomes, why do you actually not like those things? Like, why does that cause you anxiety? Like, today is, the triple threes, the 3K row, 300 double unders, 3 mile run. And that stresses me out. Why does that stress you out? Right? Because all it is it's a different type of stress. Instead of it being short, high intensity with more recovery, It's a long, consistent grind. And there's a way to train that stress adaptation. And so it's important to know, or at least ask the question, why do I enjoy this type of stress so much? And why does this other stress cause me so much either physical anxiety, which is like, hey, I'm worried about my heart rate, social anxiety, which is I'm nervous about dying on the bike in front of a bunch of other people, or cognitive anxiety, which is I think that the movement or the workout should feel and go this way, but it's not going that way, because you'll have the anxiety that increases from doing the workout. And then you also have the anxiety that increases from that physical, social, or cognitive impact as well. And so that's the baseline that I start at. And then there's like more movement stuff, but that's where I'll start. And then I'll build on top of that with each person I work with.
Yeah. And I'm sure that's kind of like a process to kind of build up on top of that to kind of like, and it's a practice, right? It's like, okay, like this is something that you need to kind of start adding as a part of your training and kind of getting used to kind of like, kind of creating that intent and that why behind obviously every single time that you go and train, right?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Awesome. Now you mentioned a lot of times, like throughout the gears and everything stuff, like you talked about that you practice and through Brian McKenzie's training, and breath work is a big thing. And I think that's one of the things that when we actually met that one time in the Nordic sauna place, you talked a lot about breath work, and we even went to one of your workshops around this stuff. And I think this is something that I'm like, incredibly fascinated by because there's so many different things in terms of capacity, in terms of like that Bumblebee thing that we did at some point, and that kind of exercise that you kind of taught us as well, into this whole entire worldwide of like breath work and understanding that we sometimes don't even know how to breathe. Right. So then I don't even know where to start around this. Right. But then I guess like, what do you, I guess, like refer to breath work? What is it specifically something that you do typically try to kind of like, let's say somebody new, they're like, okay, I heard about this thing called breath work. What is this class about, type of thing? Like, what would you typically kind of start with people on? And then maybe we can kind of get into some different techniques that maybe people can like start to implement by just simply listening to this podcast episode.
Mm-hmm. The great question to ask is, do you pay attention to your breathing at all during your day or while you train? Most people have some type of breathing pathology where in reality, most people actually overbreathe. They don't underbreathe. So when you feel breathless or you feel like you're running out of air, a lot of times it's because you're chronically overbreathing, and it's very shallow and upper chest breathing. And they actually start to see a decline in how someone breathes past the age of 5 on is where it kind of starts to decline. And that's usually when we start to have to sit in a classroom a lot more often. There's a little bit less of like hey, we're sitting on the floor. There's more recess. There's more activity. And it's more of a sit in a chair, listen to someone speak and teach you. And that's when we start to see a lot of poor breathing patterns arise, which in a general way would just be, we stop diaphragm breathing, which is a little bit more of like lower belly breath, to make it simple. And we start apical breathing, which is breathing with our chest and with our neck. So we start to get a lot of tension through the neck and through the chest and through the shoulders. The reason why breathing is so important is because it provides a great opportunity to explore something new that can dramatically change your life, because it has such an impact on how you feel throughout the day, how your training goes, and how you sleep. And the main point is too many people breathe with their mouth open and they overbreathe. And the test that I'll have people do to give them idea of where they are is called a CO2 tolerance test. Super easy to do. You just simply do it when you're at rest. So usually first thing in the morning after you kind of move around a little bit is good, or when you're most calm throughout the day. And you start off with 3 breaths, and it's all nasal breathing. You breathe in through the nose for 3 seconds. You exhale through the nose for 3 seconds. That's the first 3 breaths. On the 4th breath, you take a full inhale through your nose, and then you exhale. The moment you start to exhale through your nose, you start a timer. And again, this is on the 4th breath. And you exhale for as long and as slow as you possibly can. If you panic, if you swallow, if you like stop, start, you stop the timer. Or if you run out of air, right, you stop it. And you see how long you can get that exhale for. And the longer you get for that exhale, the likely better breathing mechanics you have and the higher CO2 tolerance you have, which essentially, right, like you have oxygen and you have CO2, and CO2 building in your blood is actually what makes you have that feeling of like, I need to breathe. And so the higher tolerance you can have to that, essentially the less breaths you'll take per minute, and likely the better breathing mechanics you have to do that. So when someone does this test, if you're below 20 seconds, it's very likely that you have very poor breathing mechanics, and your respiratory rate, which if anyone has a Whoop, it tracks that for you. The amount of breaths you take per minute is extremely high, and you're likely to be a lot more anxious, or on one end, or on the opposite end, a lot more lethargic, and in a non-clinical way, kind of like on the depressive side. 20 to 40 seconds is usually where most people fall, but the goal is to get bare minimum 60 seconds. And that's when you start to notice a lot of differences where your respiratory rate is lower, your sleep quality is better, because you're probably able to sleep with your mouth closed and only nasal breathe while you sleep, which we can for sure, that's an interesting dive in, because people that snore have sleep apnea. It's because the mouth is open while they sleep. And so there's breathing practices that can accompany that. And Brian McKenzie's website Shift has this on there where you can do the test, type in your score, and then it tells you different types of breathing exercises you can do, which is box breath variations, or what's called apnea breathing, which is where you have a semi-long inhale, a long hold, and then a longer exhale than you did inhale. And the more you do this breath work and be aware of your breathing mechanics, then the better your breathing mechanics will get, the less likely you are to be hyper anxious or on the depressive side. So you're essentially in control of your state throughout the day, right? Like what causes you to overreact or to be super like lethargic and tired. That'll happen less often, and you'll have more sustained energy. And then you'll be able to control when you want to get amped up or when you want to calm down, because you do this thing called a breath practice. And so doing that CO2 tolerance test is a really great place to start. It's just, the breath practice is one of those things where we don't think that we're breathing wrong, because it's just something that most of the time we're doing unconsciously. But the fact of the matter is, if you want to breathe properly with today's lifestyle that most people have, even people that work out a lot and eat really healthy, the bottom line is, if you end up sitting for a while or standing for a while, chances are that you don't have a good breath pattern, or excuse me, a good breathing technique, and you should have some type of breath practice.
And what are some of the consequences of that? I guess, like, is this also that it's like in way connected, as you mentioned, to like poor sleep habits, sleep apnea, as you're mentioning, maybe high stress? I know one of the workshops that you talk about these thresholds of like, stress, like hyperstimulation, understimulation, different things like that. So again, so for people listening, what are some of the consequences with, for example, you're a person that is not as much diaphragmatic, kind of breather, I guess, like you can call it, versus somebody that kind of brings a lot with your rib cage, like what are like the effects of like when you're not really a good breather, I guess?
So your experience throughout the day will be more stressful or extremely tired. That's kind of like the first thing that someone will notice improving when they start a breath practice. They'll feel less stressed, or they'll feel less tired. And that's the first negative consequence that's like really easy to experience when someone isn't doing versus is doing a breath practice. As far as like what's actually going on inside of our body, when you don't nasal breathe, which is like a keystone of having a proper breathing pattern, you're not using a lot of benefit that's going to help your lungs and the makeup of your blood as far as like CO2 versus O2. So when you breathe through the nose, it cleans the air a little bit. It warms the air, so that way it's more likely to have like a good temperature with the internal temperature of your body. So you're less likely to experience, let's say, like an exercise-induced asthma. And it also, in your nasal cavity, you have this chemical called nitrous oxide. And in appropriate amounts, it helps dilate the nasal and upper respiratory pathway. So you will literally have less of a clogged nose. Deviated septum is a little bit different of a story, but you'll have less of a clogged nose. And breathing will be easier. And it's actually natural to have one side of your nose a little bit more closed than the other, and it'll alternate sides throughout the day. It's kind of like a tide, high and low, right and left kind of open and close a little bit. But you can do breath hold techniques where you pinch your nose, and now all of a sudden, after doing a couple rounds, I can breathe through my nose more easily. It's less clogged or less stuffy. So that nitrous oxide helps with the dilation of your upper respiratory system. And then as far as like what's going on in relation to exercise, when your CO2 gets too low, which you offload more CO2 when you breathe out of your mouth, right? So a lot of mouth breathing. When you offload that CO2, you're getting a little bit more in a stressful state, right? Because your mouth breathing, that's a stress response. Your CO2 level is dropping, which chronically makes you sensitive to CO2. So in a crappy feedback loop, you get more sensitive to CO2, but in a weird way, you actually need more tolerance of it to make you feel better. And that will make you mouth breathe more often. And when you have not enough CO2, that's what actually helps the oxygen come off of the hemoglobin in the red blood cell. So if you have too low of a CO2, you can't utilize the oxygen that you do have. So now all of a sudden, it's like a little bit of a constant tiny starvation to your tissues because it's not getting oxygen as efficiently as it could. Whereas if you had a higher CO2 tolerance and you nasal breathe more, you'd have better efficiency in delivering oxygen to the blood or to the tissue that you have in your body. So you're going to start to see a lot of different negative aspects that come with that. Besides it being tired, obviously the health of your tissue, if it's not getting the fuel that it needs, it's not going to be like operating as effectively. What they see with people that also don't breathe as well is you're more likely to snore, you're more likely to have sleep apnea. So you get all of the negative things that come with poor sleep. Breathing really drastically makes those worse. So your blood pressure will be higher. You'll have a lot more like mental fogginess kind of throughout the day. Your heart rate will be a lot higher. So your resting heart rate and average heart rate will just be higher than everyone else's, kind of like on average that does have a breath practice. And then obviously if your body is working significantly harder to just do basic things like be alive, function, and walk, well, then that's not something that's going to be great for your body over time. Essentially, you're making everything less efficient by decreasing the effectiveness of this, I'll call it like an engine in your body, where if your heart, your lungs, and your diaphragm and your nose are not working together really well, everything else is going to suffer, right? Because that's going to be a huge effect essentially on how you metabolize kind of like energy, because you're literally, making this energy system less effective on all forms, whether it's sprint, whether it's moderate, or whether it's long endurance. Everything is less effective. I mean, I imagine it probably have less of an impact on sprinting. But still, if you're feeling super lethargic, well, that's not going to make you be able to sprint as hard, which would then, if we're talking lifestyle stuff, would lead to people requiring more pre-workout, more caffeine, and actually later on in times of the day. So we essentially see this bad blood pressure, too high of heart rate, can't really breathe through your nose. Now you're having sleep apnea or snoring. Now you're sleeping less quality. You're more tired. You're not getting great deep sleep. And you can see how it can just quickly snowball into this cascade of, oh man, I'm having a lot of health issues going on.
So the keystone is the breath. This is literally, so like poor breath leads to a very stressful body that is not operating as efficiently and not as effectively and can lead to this whole myriad of these situations that you're talking about.
Yes, exactly.
Much. Wow. That's insane. Yeah. And this is obviously something that I kind of started dabbling with, when I started meditation practices, right? So I'm guessing for people listening to, in a way, breathwork is in a way also a form of meditation, right? Because you're really trying to, as you're learning and adapting to these new different things, you're learning how to listen to your own breath, right? And that's a way that it also kind of encompasses within the recovery kind of realm of things, pretty much for in your opinion.
Yeah, I would say meditation is great to dive into a breath practice, and it will have, like most people that do a meditation, feel significantly better, right? The interesting thing to note, and this is just like a thought that I have and I had heard from others. And so, there's not research to support this, but it is an interesting thing to think about, which is when people meditate and those initial health benefits that come from it, is it coming from the fact that they're being more mindful, or is it coming from the fact that now for the first time, probably in a long time, they're focusing on their breathing? Because most people usually, when you start with a meditation practice, you have this thing called an anchor, at least in a more traditional type of meditation, which is when I get distracted, I go back to this thing. Yep. As someone develops a meditation practice and has more skill, they can use different things, and there's different types of meditation, but most people usually go, oh, I noticed I'm distracted, go back to the breath. So now you have this practice where literally the main point is to just have a singular focus and to notice when you're distracted and be able to pull back when you are distracted. And now you're focusing on your breathing. So there are some people that think that the significant benefits that initially come from adopting a mindfulness practice are actually due to the focus on the breath work, right? Because it's kind of one of those things where it's, am I mentally more aware and that's impacting my body? Or is it the fact that I'm changing what my body is doing, impacting the mental aspect? And I think it's probably a little bit of both.
That's crazy. Yeah. Cause like, well, we think about it this way, like, oh my God, I've been doing meditation for 3 years and
Mhm.
it's changed my life. I'm like doing this. And it's perhaps like, one of the big things that it all started with is actually kind of like, correcting your breath and learning how to breathe, like without you even paying attention to that. So that's really interesting. And I guess also from the practical aspect, like where do you teach people to start when it comes down to, okay, let's, and besides obviously doing this test that you talked about,
Mhm.
you mentioned some techniques such as box breathing and different things like that. So for somebody that is completely new to this entire world of breathing, recovery tactics and techniques and strategies, like where would you what would you start them? Like, what would be something that they can kind of start doing at home for themselves without massive, like I guess coaching or
Mhm.
guidance?
So there's two really great things that I love to start people off with. And one is having a hand on chest and hand on belly, and then just starting to do breathing and noticing what's going on. My mouth breathing, my nasal breathing, and then also importantly, which hand is rising first? Am I raising my upper hand first, as in I'm chest breathing, or is my lower hand raising first when I breathe? Because that's going to have a big impact to tell you, do you upper chest breathe or do you diaphragmatic breathe? Most people, if they go hand on belly, hand on chest, the hand on the chest will immediately rise first. So that's point number one. Just breathe, set a timer for a minute so you don't have to worry about how long you're doing it for, and just go hand on chest, hand on belly, breathe, notice what happens. And then once you notice what's going on, try and make it so that you breathe in through the lower belly first, and you try and make it a calm, relaxed inhale and calm, relaxed exhale. It doesn't need to be a deep breath. It should be a light breath. So that's kind of like point number one. Point number two is this really great exercise that I learned from the StrongFit community, which they call an external oblique opener. But at the baseline, it's a great breathing exercise for awareness. So all someone does is lie on their back with their feet near their hips as if they were about to do a glute bridge, but keeping everything on the ground. You place a kettlebell, doesn't need to be super heavy, or really any weight is fine. A plate is okay, a light dumbbell, but you place it below the belly button. And the goal is to breathe in and have the weight rise up, and then exhale and have it totally relax. And it's teaching them how to breathe in and actually create tension. So they breathe in, they create tension in their abdomen, and then they exhale and totally relax. And for people that are brand new to a breathing practice, it's pretty normal that the person might feel a little bit lightheaded because they're changing their CO2 levels a little bit. And then they start with that inhale, create tension, the object rises, exhale, totally relax. And then they can transition into, which this is a good like baseline into transitioning into how do I breathe appropriately while training, which is you breathe in to the weight, you brace, and then you exhale and push out more into the weight and maintain the tension. So it teaches the person how to inhale, create tension and relax, which has a benefit. And then you have the new skill of inhale, create tension, exhale, create more tension, inhale, maintain tension. And that's really important for when people are moving, because a lot of times people will breathe and hold their breath when they move, when in reality, in my opinion, you should be able to breathe and keep tension the entire time, regardless of even if it's like an extremely heavy deadlift or an extremely heavy back squat, or you're cycling a barbell. But those two things, the hand on chest, hand on belly, notice your breathing, try and get the lower hand to rise first. And then the object below the belly button, breathing to create tension, relax, breathing to create tension, exhale, create more tension is a great way to start. And for anyone that's like, well, how long should I do it for? Sets and reps. I like to go just put on a song and do it for the duration of a song. And that's all I got to do.
Okay. Yeah, that's phenomenal. So those are two strategies in there that you guys can kind of like implement. Now let's talk about breathwork in extreme conditions. And let's kind of like circle back around Nordic sauna here for, to kind of like wrap it up here for today. So I was introduced to this very recently because it was one of the perks of Wawa and kind of like, get discounts like Hot Water Studios for people listening and, listening here that live in Tampa. It's a great place to go and check this out. So I got introduced to this Nordic sauna, which is essentially like cold and hot exposure, not simultaneously, but like back and forth. Right. And I've heard about this for a long time. I've heard about like benefits of sauna. I've heard about benefits of cold exposure, but I never understood exactly what was it about it that actually was helpful. And then I did it. We ran into each other and we did some breath work inside of a sauna at 140, 150 degrees, which was like, pretty brutal. But I started noticing obviously the impact that it had on my recovery. In previous episodes for people listening in, I've talked about Whoop and I've talked about recovery and different things like that. So I noticed a massive shift into that. So, Mitch, can you talk a little more about, because I know now you typically do and run the sessions with, in some kind of like hours like throughout the week as well. What is this concept of Nordic sauna, and how does it work, and what are some of the benefits that people get as a result of doing it, and how to do it?
So the Nordic sauna, where the way we go is you do the hot for 8 to 12 minutes and then you do the ice for 2 to 5, is just a type of exposure therapy. And that's been around for centuries, right? Like that's nothing new. But the science and knowing why it's so beneficial is rather new. Dr. Rhonda Patrick does a lot of promoting and talking and research when it comes to saunas, more so than ice baths, but still then you can look to Wim Hof for all the benefits of the cold stuff. So the sauna is nice because it's very much vasodilation, respiratory dilation, and it's a heat shock to the body. And then with the ice, it's vasoconstriction and it's a cold shock to the body. And they've learned that when you expose your body to increasing heat and increasing cold, your body, rightfully so, views it as a threat. And the response is it releases hot or heat shock proteins and cold shock proteins. And essentially the way that these work among different things is essentially, one, you're building resilience, which is great, both physical and mental. And then your DNA, the ends of it, the telomeres, which essentially like, hey, the more those unravel, that's like your older biological age rather than the number of times you've been around the sun. It essentially helps prevent the unraveling of that over time, this like hot and cold. So besides the experienced benefits, which would be you feel better, you sleep better, you feel more resilient, and then you have a greater capacity to deal with extreme heat and extreme cold, and it's a mood enhancement, both heat and cold. You also get that actual physiological benefit so deep in the body as to say it affects your DNA, right? The going to as far as like the exercise piece goes, it does help with great recovery in the sense of heat because it's helping you with that hypertrophy aspect, right? We're increasing blood flow to the tissue. You're going to have, as long as you're eating enough protein, less of a negative turnover as far as like, am I eating enough protein to support hypertrophy or atrophy? It will help essentially make that hypertrophy more efficient. The heat will. The cold, if it's done to a certain point, can help a person develop, and it has to be like pretty cold, like brown fat tissue in the body, which is going to be better at generating heat. There's different health benefits that come from that, but it makes it less likely where you're going to start to have this like white adipose tissue continue to develop. And obviously this is kind of like only one part of like well, hey, you need to make sure you're eating well and exercise is involved. But it's just like an extra tool in a person's toolkit to have that impact on their health over time. There's also some stuff that says if you expend enough time in the cold, that shiver response can kind of help a little bit with fat burning. But I like the hot and cold from the sense of the antidepressive effects that it will have. Both heat and cold have been shown to show that it will help improve your mood. That can come a little bit from norepinephrine that gets released from the brain and in the body to kind of help improve a person's mood, as that's like a pushing the gas pedal on the body a little bit in a beneficial way. So there's that great aspect of you're changing the way that your capillaries and your blood vessels are working. Your heart's getting a workout, even though you're stationary, right? Like your heart rate goes up in the heat, down in the cold. So you're getting a workout, even though you're not like lifting or running, which has a benefit. You have the benefits of mood, the benefit of that. You have the mental resilience improvement, right? Like if you can go 15 minutes at 180, well, that's over time, you're going to be able to do 20 and then 25. And obviously you'll hit a threshold and you'll have to do breath work, but you get all these improvements from it. The experiential piece that I like to say as well is your brain acts in a way where when you get in the heat, when you get in the cold, it doesn't know that you're exposing yourself to a sauna or exposing yourself to a cold bath, right? Your body and your brain are going, what is causing this external thing? Is it going to kill me? What do I need to do to survive? And it's a very prediction-based rather than reactive-based mechanism. So when you go into the sauna and when you go into the ice, it's a very controlled way to see how your body will respond to different types of stress adaptation. So like, for example, when we have the sauna rocking at 180 or 185 and people get in, usually there's not too much of a conversation going on and the person's really starting to push that stress level line up to like higher anxiety. rightfully so, because the body's like, what is going on? What is going to be the future state of this? Am I going to be exposed to this for days or just minutes? It doesn't know. But when you add in the breath work, you can control the stress response more effectively. So like the breathing stuff that we do, the Bumblebee breathing, the as they call it there, the librarian breathing, which is a type of like shining skull, or what they call Kapalabhati breathing. And those essentially help you control the stress response in the heat and in the cold, so your body gets more effective at responding to increased stress responses, which that transfers over into everyday life and into when you're doing a training session as well. All of a sudden now it doesn't seem so overwhelming that your work schedule is more packed or that you're really hungry. Well, now all of a sudden it's easier to resist the temptation of a sweet treat or something, because you're like, man, I did 20 minutes at 180. This is fine. Yeah. I'm good to go. So there's that added benefit of mental resilience that I love so much, in the way that you get to essentially explore and experiment with how you're responding to stress. And the breath is always connected to that, right? Like you had mentioned earlier, we did the Bumblebee breathing. Well, the benefit of that is when you're doing the breath work, all of a sudden the first 5 minutes of the sauna that are really hot go by very quickly, rather than just sitting there thinking about how hot it is. So it gives you something to focus on. And then physiologically, you're in the sauna, you're getting a stress response. Your sympathetic nervous system, which is, we'll say, more of the gas pedal, starts to get activated. Well, that Bumblebee breathing, when you hum or when you buzz and your upper palate vibrates, and you have a longer exhale, both of those are connected to this thing called the vagus nerve, which help apply the brake a little bit, where it's a little bit more of a calming effect on the body. So essentially you learn breathing techniques that help either amp you up to deal with a new stressor, or to help calm you down while you're in the middle of the stressor. And that can be applied also, like the breathing techniques someone does in the hot and in the cold, that can be done during a stressful workday or during an intense, like long hike or ruck or whatever it is that someone wants to do. All you need to do is just stop and have an opportunity to breathe, because you will physiologically change what's going on in your body, which will impact your perception of what's happening, which changes the way that you respond to the stressor. And that's why the sauna and the ice bath is so important, because it's not just the antidepressive, you're getting a heart rate workout, and it's like a way to exercise without really working, let's say, putting stress on the body as far as an external load. But it's so important because it helps you change how you respond to stress over time. And chronic stress is going to be the thing that ends up really wrecking most people, because then the beneficial stress of exercise kind of gets masked by the negative stress of perhaps working out too intensely, not being able to respond to the stressor appropriately, or the work life that someone has.
Yeah, dude, it's fascinating, because I think it's like a lot of times like we fear things that, and we just say, like, I think like I put some of the stories, and I was like, and people would tell me like I could never do that. Right. Mm-hmm. And then they just kind of like always say like, I could never do something like that. I could never get myself in an ice tub. Like, and it's because of the fact that they kind of have a lot of resistance, and most likely the same people is like, they're just try to avoid anything that makes them uncomfortable. And mm-hmm. with things like they avoid things that makes them uncomfortable, I would also kind of dare to say that they probably kind of have struggle being able to be more resilient in kind of certain situations, versus obviously you kind of putting yourself through this. So obviously that's why I like CrossFit. That's why I like all these different mm-hmm. things, because it's getting yourself in an uncomfortable situation, which is actually where physiological growth and adaptation, I guess, is really what it happens, right?
Exactly. So,
yeah, dude, that's fascinating. So, and now, because like I have clients all around the country, all around the world, and I think they've asked me about this stuff. It's not always easy to find a place that do kind of like both. Mm-hmm. What would you suggest for people that, say, somebody that lives in like either not necessarily a remote area or whatever, but like, so they can kind of incorporate this practice? It's just as simple to kind of go and find like a place that have a sauna, and maybe just like, come home and do like, get some like bags of ice and do some cold tub, as simple as that? Or is there another kind of like way or strategy that you would recommend for people that may not have an actual studio that have this facility that it's all kind of like guided and everything that you guys have it in Katawari?
So if you have a gym near you that you can join, even if it's just for the sauna, depending on, right, like, you essentially have to weigh and measure like what's the investment versus the return on reward for that. And that's each person's own independent conversation that they'll have to have with themselves or their loved ones that they want to be involved. But looking for a local gym that has one, it's unlikely you'll be able to control the experience as much if it's just like, hey, the sauna's open like all day and we don't run classes. But you're still going to at least get the benefit where maybe you can't go hot, cold, but being able to do just hot or just cold is a nice benefit. So finding something that's near you, if possible, even though it's not going to be perhaps quite the same experience of running a class. You can also do, and a person would need to be careful with this, like a hot shower. But there's like, I want to say it shouldn't go above a certain temperature. I think it might be 120 because that's where it becomes like scalding. It can actually like burn your skin. So using hot showers can help be a way to expose yourself to heat. And if you want to go just heat, then you do just the hot shower. Try and expose as much of your body to it as possible. You'll have probably different sensitivities. Like for me, for example, if I get a hot shower, it's my upper back and lower back that are really sensitive to it, but everything else is totally fine. You can then go hot, cold by going really hot, really cold, back and forth, couple minutes really hot, couple minutes really cold in the shower. So you have that opportunity as well if you have access to a shower. If you have at bare minimum a bathtub, then you get to do the ice bath, right? You get bags of ice, you pour it in there, or you just fill it up with cold water right away from the tub, just put it on full blast cold. And again, doing breathing techniques before you get into the heat and before you get into the cold can be helpful. So even just if someone does basic box breathing, it's going to make a difference. You can look up the Wim Hof stuff and other things, but if you're just doing like, hey, pick a number of seconds, usually 3, 4, or 5 is an okay place to start, and just do that much for the inhale, hold, exhale, and hold. Do that before and during. You'll have a nice challenge. Or if someone wants to spend a little bit more to invest, you can go with things like just a general big ice bucket that you could probably get a tub from like a Home Depot or something like that, or like a hardware store. Fill it up with water, fill it up with ice, you're good to go. You could go a little bit more of the expensive route where now you're getting into things like the cold plunge or the ice barrel things that circulate the cold water for you. But now we're talking about, roughly a couple $1,000s of an investment. Someone could also go that route for an at-home sauna, right? I didn't realize this till just recently, but you can get a decent small at-home sauna, like one that you can actually get into and isn't just a infrared zip up, because infrared's a little bit different. You can get an at-home sauna for like $3,500, $4,500, which is expensive.
Yeah,
but it's all about, hey, what's the investment and what's the return? Like for me, as soon as I have a home, I'm for sure saving up to get a sauna at the house. I want to be able to do that thing Monday through Sunday.
Yeah.
But those are different ways, whether it's hot shower, cold shower, hot bath, cold bath, or trying to find a local facility that has some type of hot sauna, or some places have cold pools, right? Where it's like hot, medium, cold, really cold that you're able to dive into. But for sure, figuring out a way to get involved with heat and cold exposure is no matter what going to benefit the individual, even if they can only do one of those things.
Yeah. And I feel like even people that live up north, like when they kind of gets winter and they live by a lake or something like that, that's also a pretty super easy. You don't even have to get ice type of thing to be able to kind of get exposure to some of those things.
That's going to be extra cold.
Yeah, definitely. So that's cool, man. That's awesome. Well, I want to be respectful of your time, man, but this has been incredibly helpful for people listening in right now live, or people that are going to listen to this episode when it comes live on our podcast. Last few things that I like to kind of dive into before we kind of like talk about what you do and where you do it and how people can find you is like just simple rapid fire questions I like to kind of finish up this with. And we'll go with just 4 simple ones. First one would be, what is your favorite? So first thing that comes to mind, favorite type of movement or exercise you like to do?
That external oblique opener, the kettlebell breathing.
Cool. Awesome. Second thing would be, what is a book that you would give to anybody during Christmas that they need to absolutely have in their bookshelf?
Oh, damn. That's a good one. Breathe by James Nestor.
Okay, cool. We're going to link it up on the show notes. Third would be, what is a good resource, podcast, YouTube video, anything like online that you feel like it's helpful for people just to learn about anything in specific? It doesn't have to be breathwork. It can be anything, honestly.
StrongFit Podcast, movement, philosophy, breathing, all sorts of crazy stuff.
That's awesome. Okay, we'll link it up as well. And the last one is a fun one, which is if you were stranded in a desert island for the rest of your life, and you could choose one food and one food only to live off of, what would you choose?
Pizza, for sure.
Okay. You're not in the same boat. That's exactly what I would do. Oh man, that's a good one. Cool, man. Mitch, where can people find you, man? And like ask you questions about this, like connect with you. And then we'll do it different this time. So maybe locally would be one for people that live in the Tampa Bay area, if you're a listener in the Florida, Tampa Bay area, and also online as well. So how can people find you so we can kind of link that up to in the show notes of this podcast?
So if you're local, I work at South Tampa CrossFit, which is near Gandy and Manhattan intersection. If you're down that way, and I do like group class coaching, and then most of the stuff I do is one-on-one work. If anyone's interested in doing movement rehab and breath work, so that's the in-person one. And then online, the main thing I have is just my Instagram account. That's where I do most of my stuff, and I'll be in the future I'll be using an app called Mighty Networks, but my Instagram handle is sweet_Mitch. And that way, that's in my link in bio. They can book to meet with me. I answer questions if anyone asks them. I love interacting with anyone that has questions on stuff like this, because I love to talk about stuff like this. But those are my two main ways to get in touch with me, either in person at South Tampa CrossFit or through my Instagram account.
Do you also do work online with people if they don't live in Tampa?
Yes. So right now I do like stress related training, which is where I give people breath work and intention setting stuff to complement whatever their fitness routine is, CrossFit, endurance, powerlifting, whatever, with like some accessory stuff. And then starting in December, I will have a templated program that essentially will help people go through everything that we mentioned, where it's like the breath work, the barefoot, learning how to explore, learning how to feel your muscles. I'll just have a multi-week templated program that'll start to be running through on like a subscription-based platform. But the cool piece is it'll also have a activity feed where people can upload videos, ask questions, and I'll be going through that every day to answer questions that people have.
That's exciting, dude. That's awesome. Well, make sure that you follow Mitch on Instagram, Sweet Mitch. And I'll put a link it up in the show notes so we make sure that we don't kind of like miss that, and so you can stay updated, asking questions, or just simply get connected. So perhaps you can kind of join in that program in the future when you release it. So, dude, thank you so much for taking the time to be here today, and hopefully we'll maybe bring you in the future to talk more chop about some of this stuff, man. So,
of course, I'd love to. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely.